The gravy was burning, and Henrietta Ramsey knew exactly what she was doing. She stood at the iron stove in the kitchen of the Yates ranch house on that cold October morning in 1882, the handle of the cast-iron skillet warm beneath her palm, and she let the smell of scorched flour and beef drippings curl up toward the low ceiling like a dark, deliberate confession. She could have stirred it. She could have added a splash of water, lowered the flame, rescued the whole pot with the ease of someone who had been cooking since before she could reach a counter without standing on a stool. But she did not stir it. She let it burn and she listened. What she heard changed everything. From the long pinewood table behind her came a sound she had not heard in all the weeks she had lived under this roof. It started small, barely more than a breath, and then it broke open into something genuine and unguarded, and she had to press her lips together hard to keep from making a sound of her own. Because the sound coming from that table was laughter. Real laughter, the kind that cannot be faked or forced, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and helpless inside a child who has forgotten, for just one undefended moment, that the world can be a place of grief. 7-year-old Samuel Yates pressed both hands over his mouth, his dark eyes wide above his fingers, as if the laughter surprised even him. Beside him, 9-year-old Thomas let out a full-throated whoop and slapped the table, rattling the tin cups. And even quiet, watchful 10-year-old Eli, the one who had barely spoken 3 words to Henrietta since her arrival, cracked into a grin so wide it looked like it might split his face clean in two. She had burned the gravy on purpose. And those boys who had not laughed at breakfast in months were laughing now. But across the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and his jaw set in that rigid line she had come to know as the wall he kept between himself and the world, stood Clayton Yates. His eyes moved from his boys to her back, and in that single unguarded second before he locked himself down again, she saw something in his face that looked dangerously close to gratitude. Or maybe it was something older and more complicated than gratitude. Maybe it was the beginning of the thing they had both been fighting since the day she arrived, but they were not there yet, not by a long stretch. To understand what that burned gravy meant, and why those boys had stopped laughing in the first place, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to the September morning 6 weeks earlier when Henrietta Ramsey stepped off the southbound stage in Colder Creek, Texas, with 2 carpet bags, a sewing kit, a letter of agreement tucked inside her coat, and a dark past she had not told a single soul about. The town of Colder Creek sat at the edge of the Edwards Plateau in the autumn of 1882 like something that had been dropped there by accident, and had not yet decided whether to stay. There were maybe 400 souls in the town proper, a general store run by a man named Holt who smelled permanently of gunpowder and molasses, a post office that doubled as a barber, a small white church with a crooked steeple, a saloon called the Dusty Gentleman that did its best business on Friday nights, and a telegraph office that connected Colder Creek to the rest of the world by a thin wire strung on wooden poles across 200 miles of dry grass. It was through that telegraph wire that Henrietta Ramsey had come to exist in Clayton Yates' life, not romantically, not at first, practically, the way a solution to a desperate problem arrives. Clayton had lost his wife, Margaret, 14 months before Henrietta stepped off that stage. Margaret had died of a fever in the summer of 1881, taking with her the center of the Yates household and leaving behind 3 boys, 400 acres of ranch land, a herd of cattle that needed constant management, and a man who did not know the first thing about how to be both a father and a rancher at the same time without falling to pieces. He had managed the ranching. He had not managed much else. His neighbor and closest friend, a broad-shouldered German man named Friedrich Baumann who ran the next spread over, was the one who had first suggested the advertisement. A domestic arrangement, Friedrich had called it, the words chosen carefully because he knew Clayton's pride and how easily it bruised. Not a mail-order bride exactly, though the newspapers ran such things all the time and no one blinked twice. More of a housekeeper arrangement with the possibility of something more. Someone to manage the household, to cook for the boys, to keep the place from descending entirely into the chaos it had been sliding toward for the better part of a year. Clayton had resisted the idea for 3 months. He had been resistant to nearly everything since Margaret died, which was understandable, which was human, but which was also quietly breaking his children apart at the seams. Thomas had started getting into fights with boys at the schoolhouse in town. Samuel had developed a stammer that wasn't there before. And Eli, the oldest, had gone so silent and inward that the schoolteacher, Mrs. Popworth, had sent a note home with him saying she was worried about his state of mind. The note had been the thing that finally broke Clayton's resistance. He had read it 3 times standing alone in the barn, and then he had walked to the telegraph office and sent an inquiry to the agency in San Antonio that Friedrich had given him the name of. Henrietta Ramsey had been the agency's response. What the agency's letter said about her was this. She was 26 years old, she was from Beaumont, Texas. She had experience managing a household. She was of sound health and good moral character. She could cook and sew and manage the basic medical needs of a family. And she was willing to relocate to a ranching property in the Western Hill Country on mutually agreed upon terms. What the agency's letter did not say was anything about why a 26-year-old woman of apparent competence and good character was sending herself to live with strangers in the middle of cattle country, with nothing but 2 carpet bags and a sewing kit. It did not mention the betrayal she was running from. It did not mention the man in Beaumont whose name she had come within 3 days of taking as her own before she discovered what he was. It did not mention the secret she was carrying, which was not a child, but was something in some ways heavier than that. A secret about who she was, where she came from, and why the life she had been living in Beaumont had come apart around her like wet paper in a storm. She carried all of that onto the stage and across 200 miles of Texas scrubland, and when she stepped down into the dust of Colder Creek with both her bags in hand, the first person she saw was Clayton Yates. He was standing beside a wagon drawn by 2 bay horses, his hat pulled low against the morning glare. He was taller than she had pictured, which was foolish because she hadn't pictured him specifically at all, only a general shape of a man who needed practical help. But Clayton Yates had a specific shape. He was broad across the shoulders and lean through the middle, with hands that looked like they had been doing hard work since before the rest of him caught up, and a face that was angular and sun-darkened, and carrying at least a year's worth of unprocessed grief in the set of his mouth. He looked at her. He did not smile. He nodded once, the way a man nods at something he has accepted without being happy about it. She nodded back the same way. He took one of her bags without asking and put it in the wagon. She climbed up on the seat without waiting for help. He got up on the other side and they drove the 7 miles out to the Yates ranch in almost complete silence, which suited them both just fine. The ranch house was a single-story structure built from limestone and cedar, solid and well-made, the kind of building that was meant to last and had been built with that intention. There was a front porch with 2 chairs that no one appeared to be using. There was a good-sized barn to the left and a smaller outbuilding to the right that housed feed and tools. There were 3 horses in a paddock, several chickens roaming loose, and a vegetable garden at the side of the house that had gone to seed sometime in the past several months and not been attended to since. The neglect of the garden told Henrietta more about the state of this household than anything Clayton Yates could have said in words. The boys were waiting on the porch when the wagon rolled up. They had arranged themselves in a line without being told to, which Henrietta recognized immediately as something they had practiced, a formal presentation they had decided on together, which meant they had talked about her arrival and were trying to present well, which meant they were nervous and hopeful and trying not to show either. It broke her heart a little. Thomas, the middle boy, held out his hand with great ceremony when she climbed down from the wagon. He was a solidly built child with his father's dark eyes and a jaw already setting toward stubbornness. He said, "How do you do, miss?" with the gravity of someone conducting official business. Samuel, the youngest, was holding the hem of his shirt in both fists and watching her from under his lashes. He had brown hair that was longer than it probably should have been, and a smear of something on his cheek that she chose not to examine too closely. He did not offer his hand. He said, very carefully, around a slight catch in the words, "Can you make pie?" She told him she could make excellent pie and watched the anxiety in his small face ease by several degrees. Eli said nothing. He looked at her for a long, measuring moment, and then he went back inside the house. Clayton watched him go and then said, without apologizing for it, "He takes time." She said, "That's all right. I have time." It was not a lie exactly, but it was not the complete truth either, because Henrietta Ramsey was running from something, and time was the one thing she could not be entirely sure of. The first 2 weeks were about establishing territory and trust in equal measure, which are essentially the same problem approached from different directions. She cleaned the house without making anyone feel it was a criticism. She cooked meals that were adequate and sometimes better than adequate. She mended the boys' clothes and sorted through a pantry that had fallen into chaos. She did not attempt to replace Margaret Yates or to make anyone pretend she might. She simply did the work in front of her and kept her own counsel and waited. Clayton moved around her in the household with the careful courtesy of a man who was not sure what the rules were. He said please and thank you with consistency. He did not interfere with how she managed the kitchen or the boys' routines. He ate what she cooked and made no comments either way. At dinner, he asked the boys about their day and listened to the answers with his full attention, which told her that whatever else had come apart in this house, the love he had for those children was still absolutely intact and uncompromised. That mattered to her more than she had expected it to. She learned his patterns. He was up before dawn, always, out to the barn to check on the animals before the sun came over the ridge. He came in for breakfast at 6:30 sharp. He worked the range through the day with 2 ranch hands named DeVoe and Carver, both of whom came to the kitchen for their noon meal and were unfailingly polite to her. He was back for supper before dark. He went over his ledgers at the kitchen table in the evenings after the boys were in bed, by the light of an oil lamp, and sometimes he sat there so still and for so long that she wondered if he was working or just sitting. She did not ask. It was not yet the kind of relationship where she could ask. What she did not expect was the way Colder Creek itself would complicate things. She had thought the hardest part of her arrival would be the grief inside the Yates household, and she was not wrong that this was hard. But the hardest thing turned out to be a woman named Dolores Fitch, who was the wife of the town's most prosperous landowner, Owen Fitch, and who had apparently decided within approximately 48 hours of Henrietta's arrival that Henrietta represented some kind of threat that needed to be managed. Dolores Fitch was 41 years old, expertly dressed by the standards of Colder Creek in 1882, and possessed of a social authority that operated in the town like a second set of laws, unofficial but very effective. She called on Henrietta with 2 other women in tow, a Mrs. Albright and a Mrs. Seger, in the second week. They sat in the parlor and drank coffee and said nothing directly unpleasant, but everything they said had a second meaning underneath it like a trap door in a floor. They asked about her family in Beaumont. They asked what had brought her to make such a drastic choice. They said, and Mrs. Fitch said this with particular smoothness, that they hoped poor Clayton would find some peace, because he had been so devoted to Margaret, so absolutely devoted, that it was hard to imagine how any woman could step into that kind of sacred history. Henrietta met every word of it with pleasant, steady composure, because she had been managing versions of this particular conversation her entire adult life, and she knew that the worst thing you could do in front of a woman like Dolores Fitch was to show her where the soft places were. But after they left, She stood at the kitchen window for a long time and looked at the dead garden, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about Beaumont, and she thought about the man named Gerald Ashby who had smiled at her for 2 years and told her she was everything he had ever wanted, and whom she had nearly married before she discovered that nearly every word he had said to her had been built on a hidden motive that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with the small piece of property her mother had left her in her will. The betrayal of Gerald Ashby had been so thorough and so devastating that it had rearranged the way she understood her own instincts. She had believed him. She had believed every word, and the discovery that she had been deceived so completely had left her not just heartbroken but genuinely unsure of her own judgment in a way that frightened her. It was why she had left Beaumont, not just because staying would have meant seeing him, though that was part of it, but because she needed to go somewhere that had no knowledge of the story, where she could be only herself, and not the woman who had almost been fooled into a marriage of convenience by a man with a charming face and a dark past he kept hidden in a drawer. Calder Creek had no knowledge of the story. And so she had come here, and she was building something new in the rubble of the old, which was exactly what the dead garden needed too. She started working on the garden in her 3rd week. She did it in the early mornings before the boys were up, and in the late afternoons when the cooking was done and the light was still good. She pulled the dead growth by hand and turned the soil with a short-handled spade she found in the tool shed, and she replanted what could be replanted for the season and prepared the rest of the beds for spring. Eli watched her from the kitchen window the first time. The second time, he appeared in the doorway of the house and stood there for a while. The third time he came out to the garden without being asked and crouched down in the dirt beside her and started pulling weeds. He did not say anything for a long time. She did not say anything either. She just moved over to give him room and handed him the smaller of the 2 trowels, and they worked side by side in the quiet morning air. After a while he said, "My mother planted those." She said, "I know. I'm sorry she's gone." He looked at her sideways, checking for something in her face. Whatever he was checking for, he seemed to find it satisfactory, because he went back to weeding without any further comment. But something had shifted. It was not warmth yet. It was the thing that comes before warmth, which is trust that is deciding whether it wants to become something more. She had been expecting the grief to be the wall she had to climb in this house. She had not expected the wall to be Clayton himself. Not because he was unkind. He was not unkind. He was rigorously courteous and completely consistent, and in a way that was almost more difficult than cruelty would have been, because cruelty gives you something to push against. Courtesy that is also distance gives you nothing to hold. The thing she had not accounted for, the thing she had not factored into her practical calculation of this arrangement, was that Clayton Yates was an interesting man. Not interesting in a surface way, not impressive in the showboating way of a man who knows he is being watched. Interesting in the quiet, cumulative way, the way a landscape is interesting, where the more you look at it, the more there is to see. She saw it in the way he talked to his horses. She saw it in the evenings at the kitchen table, when he sometimes read aloud to the boys from a volume of stories he kept on the sideboard, and his voice was low and steady, and he paused at the right places, and the boys leaned in without realizing they were doing it. She saw it in the way he handled a problem with a fence line in the south pasture, not with anger or force, but with a patient, methodical working through of the issue that took most of a morning, and resulted in a solution so neat it was almost elegant. She saw it, and she filed it away very carefully behind the wall she had built in herself since Gerald Ashby, and she told herself it was simply information, the kind of information you gather about anyone you live in proximity to. It did not mean anything beyond that. She was quite convincing on this point for approximately 5 weeks. The thing that began dismantling her careful position happened in the 5th week, on a Wednesday evening, when she was in the kitchen after supper attempting to patch one of Thomas's school shirts, which had developed a tear of truly impressive dimensions across the back, and Clayton came in from the ledger table and set a cup of coffee on the table beside her without being asked. She looked up at the cup and then at him. He said, "I noticed you didn't pour yourself any at supper. I thought you might want some now. It was such a small thing. It was such an unremarkable, ordinary, small act of attention." But she had not been paid attention to in so long, had not had anyone notice the small, ordinary facts of her preferences and act on them without being prompted, that she felt the thing land somewhere deep in her chest with a weight that startled her. She said, "Thank you." He said, "It's nothing." He started to go back to the other room. Then he stopped in the doorway and said, without turning around, "Eli told me you two have been working in the garden." She said, "Yes." He said, "Margaret always said that garden was her best thing." She waited. He said, "I think she would have been glad to see it worked again." Then he went back to his ledgers, and she sat with her sewing and her coffee and her own rapidly deteriorating certainties for a long time. The secret she carried, the thing she had not told anyone in Colder Creek, had a name, and it was this. Henrietta Ramsey was not only Henrietta Ramsey. Her mother, Eleanor Ramsey, had been a woman of mixed heritage, part black and part white, who had passed as white in Beaumont, and had raised Henrietta to do the same because it was 1856 when Henrietta was born and survival required it, and Eleanor knew the landscape of survival in America better than most people know any landscape at all. Gerald Ashby had not known, or she had believed he didn't know. What she eventually discovered was that he did know, had known from the beginning, and that his hidden motive for pursuing her had not only been the property, but also a darker, more dangerous design, involving a man he was working with who was collecting information about mixed-race families who had been passing as white, for purposes that frightened her all the way down to her bones. She had destroyed every document she could think of and left Beaumont within the week of the discovery, and she had come to Colder Creek, where there was no connected history of her family, no paper trail, nothing that could be followed. The anxiety of this secret was something she lived with every day, a low-grade awareness always running under the surface of her ordinary life, a trap she was always checking to make sure had not been sprung. She did not know if she would ever tell it. She did not know if she was safe. She only knew that she was safer here, on this remote ranch in the hill country, than she had been in Beaumont. The irony that had not escaped her was that she had come to this place running from a forced choice and a dark past, and what she had found here was a man who was also living in the aftermath of something that had forced him, who was also navigating a life he had not designed for himself, but had been handed, and who was also doing his level best to hold the pieces together without letting anyone see how much effort that required. It was the 6th week when the morning came that would later seem like the hinge between everything before and everything after. Clayton had ridden out early to the south pasture with DeVoe to deal with a section of fence that had come down in the night, which meant he would not be back for breakfast. She had made the gravy for the biscuits that morning the same way she always did, from the beef drippings saved from the previous evening's supper, thickened with flour, seasoned with salt, and a small amount of black pepper. It was a reliable, adequate gravy, the kind that sits on a biscuit without complaint and feeds 3 boys without anyone having any opinions about it one way or another. She had served it for 5 mornings in a row. And for 5 mornings in a row, the table had been quiet in the way it was always quiet. Thomas stabbed at his food without enthusiasm. Samuel picked at things. Eli ate with the systematic efficiency of someone fueling a machine and nothing more. No conversation, no laughter, nothing that sounded like children, something that sounded like small, bereaved adults going through the motions. She had been thinking about this for several days. She had been thinking about the nature of grief in children and how sometimes it becomes a habit, a groove that deepens with repetition until the groove itself starts to feel like the identity. She had been thinking about what her own mother had done for her once, when Henrietta was 9 years old and they had lost her father to typhoid, and the whole household had gone gray with mourning. Her mother had done something so small and so deliberately ridiculous that it had punctured the gray, just for a moment, just long enough to let some light back in. Her mother had dramatically, catastrophically burned the cornbread. She had stood at the stove with her back to 9-year-old Henrietta and let the smoke curl up and the smell of char fill the kitchen. And then she had turned around with the pan held out in front of her and a look of exaggerated tragedy on her face. And she had said, "Well, I believe I have murdered the cornbread." And Henrietta had laughed so hard she had to sit down on the kitchen floor, and something had broken loose in her chest that had been pressed down tight for weeks. And after that the gray had not been so absolute. On that October morning in 1882, Henrietta Ramsey stood at the iron stove on the Yates ranch and let the gravy burn on purpose. She did not say anything. She did not perform it. She just let it burn until the smell was unmistakable, and then she turned around holding the skillet and looked at the three boys with an expression of elaborate, dismayed puzzlement, as if the gravy had managed to ruin itself entirely without her knowledge or consent. Samuel laughed first, and then Thomas, and then Eli, and the sound of it filled the kitchen and ran up the walls and out into the cold morning air. And in the doorway, Clayton Yates watched his sons laugh at breakfast for the first time in months, and the look on his face was something she was not going to be able to file away carefully or classify as simply information. He came inside. He sat down at the table. He looked at her with those dark eyes and he said very quietly what happened to the gravy. She said, "I believe it outpaced me." He said nothing for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was not a large smile. It was small and a little rusty, the smile of a man relearning a muscle he had not used in a while. But it was real, and it reached his eyes, and Thomas saw it and said, "Pa, you're smiling," in a tone of such pure, unfiltered surprise that the whole table erupted again and even Clayton laughed. And Henrietta stood at the stove with the burned gravy skillet still in her hand and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something that felt dangerously like belonging. She made fresh gravy without ceremony and served breakfast, and the meal that followed was different from any breakfast that had come before it in the 6 weeks she had been here. The boys talked. Thomas told a story about something that had happened at the schoolhouse with a boy named Fletcher that involved a garter snake and a considerable amount of chaos. Samuel said, around a mouthful of biscuit, that he wanted a dog, and then looked at his father with enormous anticipation. Eli, with the careful precision of someone choosing his words, said that he had read in the almanac that it was going to be a cold winter, and that they should probably reinforce the henhouse before November. Clayton listened to all of it with his coffee cup in his hand and his elbows on the table, which was something he had never done before, and he nodded and responded and asked questions, and Henrietta moved between the table and the stove and said almost nothing, and felt the texture of the room change around her like something thawing. She had not planned to fall in love with Clayton Yates. She had planned the opposite of that with considerable deliberateness. She had come here to be useful and to be safe and to rebuild herself from the inside out, and romantic entanglement was a complication she could not afford, especially not with a man who was still moving through grief, especially not with a man who did not know the most important thing about her. The secret, the dark past, the thing she had never told. The fear of what it would mean to tell him was rooted in something specific and historical, and not imaginary. In Texas in 1882, being of mixed heritage in a family that had passed as white was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that could be used against a person. It was the kind of thing that people in certain positions of power or prejudice could weaponize in ways that were frightening and sometimes had been fatal. She did not know Clayton Yates' heart on this matter. She knew the good things she had observed. She did not know the rest. And so she said nothing, and she kept the wall up, and she tried very hard not to notice that the wall was becoming more difficult to maintain. The shift in the household after the burned gravy morning was gradual but real. The boys opened up around her with increasing ease, the way a hand opens when the cold finally gets out of it. Thomas began telling her stories from the schoolhouse with an energy that required audience participation. Samuel abandoned his earlier wariness entirely and began following her around the kitchen asking questions with the relentless curiosity of a child who has decided someone is worth knowing. Even Eli, steady, quiet Eli, began speaking to her at length in the evenings, about the almanac, about the livestock, about a book he was reading, about things that mattered to him, and she met every conversation with the full, genuine attention she would give to anyone she respected. Clayton watched all of this. She caught him watching sometimes, and he always shifted his eyes away when she caught him, but not quite fast enough, and she could see in those unguarded fractions of a second that what he was watching was not her specifically but the effect of her presence, the way his sons were breathing differently, moving differently, the way the house had a sound to it now that it had not had before. She thought he was grateful, and she was probably right about that. She did not yet know he was also something else. The thing that forced matters into the open was Dollar's Fitch, and it happened in October, about 10 days after the burned gravy morning at the general store in town. Henrietta had driven the wagon into Colder Creek on a Tuesday to collect the weekly supplies. She had a list from Clayton and a list of her own, and she moved efficiently through the general store with Holt behind the counter helping her fill both lists. She was waiting for Holt to cut the length of ribbon she needed for a dress alteration when she heard Dollar's Fitch's voice from the other side of a tall shelving unit, speaking to Mrs. Albright in the carrying tone of a woman who knows her voice carries and does not mind. Dollar's was saying that it was simply remarkable, the way some women would capitalize on a grieving man's vulnerability. She was saying that it was one thing to be a domestic help, which she said the word domestic help with a very particular emphasis, and another thing entirely to be angling for something more permanent in a house that still had the memory of a good woman in it. Henrietta stood very still with the bolt of ribbon in her hands. Dollar said that she had made some inquiries through friends in Beaumont. She said it carefully, through friends in Beaumont, and that there were some questions about Miss Ramsey's background that were, she searched for the word, interesting. Henrietta set down the ribbon with great care, thanked Holt, and left. She sat in the wagon outside the store for a long time. Her hands on the reins were steady. Everything else inside her was not, through friends in Beaumont. Dollar's Fitch had made inquiries through friends in Beaumont. The trap had not been sprung yet, but it was being set, and the sound of the setting was unmistakable. She drove home. She made supper. She moved through the evening with her usual efficiency and gave nothing away because she had been trained by circumstances to give nothing away, and the training was very effective. After supper, after the boys were in bed, she sat in the kitchen with her hands around her coffee cup and thought about what she was going to do. She could leave. She could pack her bags tonight and be on the morning stage and be gone from Colder Creek before anyone could do anything about it. And this family she had been slowly, carefully learning to care for would wake up to find her gone, and that would be a harm she would carry for a long time. She could stay and do nothing and wait to see how far Dollar's Fitch's inquiry reached and what it turned up and what she chose to do with what it turned up. Or she could tell Clayton. She sat with the options for a long time, and by the end of it she had not made a decision, but she had moved closer to something. Clayton found her at the kitchen table. He came in from his evening check on the livestock, pulled off his coat, and saw her sitting there in the way she was sitting, which was not her usual posture, and he stopped. He said, "Is something wrong?" She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." He sat down across the table from her. He set his hat on the table beside him. He looked at her and waited with that complete, patient attention she had come to know was one of his particular qualities. She told him about her mother, Eleanor. She told him about her father, James Ramsey, a white man from Georgia who had loved Eleanor genuinely and completely, and had married her in a private ceremony that was never formally documented because the world they lived in did not permit it to be documented. She told him about growing up in Beaumont in the careful negotiation of identity that her mother had taught her was survival. She told him about Gerald Ashby, about the 2 years, about the betrayal, about what she had discovered and what it had meant, and why she had left. She told him about Dolores Fitch and what she had overheard that afternoon. She told him all of it, and she kept her voice level and her hands flat on the table, and she did not look away from him once, because she had decided somewhere in the telling that she was not going to be diminished by this. Whatever happened next, she was going to look it in the face and let him look at her looking it in the face. When she finished, there was silence. Clayton Yates sat across from her, and he was very still. She waited. He said, "This man, this Ashby in Beaumont, did he hurt you?" It was not what she had expected him to say first. She had expected something about the heritage, about the truth, about the deception of not telling him sooner. She said, "Not physically." He said, "Other ways can be worse." She looked at him. He said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry any of it happened to you." She said, "Are you going to ask me to leave?" He looked at her as if the question was so far outside the territory of what he had been thinking that he needed a moment to locate it. He said, "No. Why would I ask you to leave?" She said, "Because of what I told you about my mother." He said, "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She said she was. He said, "And what she did, raising you the way she did, protecting you the way she did, that was love. That's what love does. It does whatever it has to do." She pressed her lips together. He said, "As for Dolores Fitch, she has been interfering in other people's business since before she could walk, and she has never managed to do as much damage as she intends to, because people in this town are not all of them as narrow as she is." Henrietta said, "She is trying to find out about my history." Clayton said, "She can look as hard as she wants. What she will find is a woman who came here and worked hard and took care of my sons and brought laughter back into this house when I did not know how to do it myself. That is what she will find, and that is what this town will see, and if Dolores Fitch wants to say otherwise, she will have to say it to my face." The quiet that followed that was different from the previous quiet. It had a different quality, the way air has a different quality before a rain, charged and weighted with something that has not yet come down but is about to. She said, "Clayton." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You don't have to thank me for the truth." She thought about that for a long time after he went to bed. She thought about it in the dark, and she thought about it in the morning, and she was still thinking about it 3 days later when Dolores Fitch arrived at the ranch. She came alone this time, which told Henrietta something. The group visits were performance, social armor. The alone visit was something more direct. Henrietta answered the door and let her in because she was not going to pretend Dolores Fitch scared her, even though some part of her was afraid of what this visit meant. They sat in the parlor. Henrietta poured coffee. She let Dolores choose her approach. Dolores Fitch said, "I have spoken with a woman in Beaumont, a Mrs. Clara Hayne, who was a neighbor of your family. She says that your mother was a colored woman who passed as white." Henrietta said, "My mother was a woman who loved her family and did whatever was necessary to keep them safe." "Yes." Dolores looked at her, recalibrating something. She had apparently expected a different reaction, denial perhaps, or fear. She said, "You're not going to argue it." Henrietta said, "No." Dolores said, "You understand that if this becomes widely known in this town, it creates a difficult situation." Henrietta said, "Difficult for whom specifically?" Dolores said, "For the Yates family, for Clayton's reputation, for the boy's position in this community." Henrietta said, "Have you spoken to Clayton about your concerns?" Dolores said, "I'm speaking to you." Henrietta said, "I think, Mrs. Fitch, that you should speak to Clayton. He is the head of this household, and anything that affects his family is something he should be part of deciding." Dolores Fitch looked at her for a long moment, and then she said something that was the most honest thing she had said since she arrived. She said, "I was a close friend of Margaret's. Margaret was the best woman I have ever known, and I know that the best way to honor her memory is to protect what she built." Henrietta said quietly, I agree with that completely. And I think what Margaret built was a family that loves each other. I have been trying to protect that since I arrived. Not to replace her. Not to erase her, but to make sure those boys have a home that is warm enough to live in. Something moved in Dollars Fitch's face. It was brief and quickly controlled, but it was there. A crack in the armor through which something softer and more complicated was briefly visible. She left without resolving anything. But she also left without delivering whatever ultimatum or threat Henrietta had been bracing for, and in the days that followed she did not speak about it in town, at least not as far as Henrietta could tell from the absence of any visible consequence. Clayton asked her how the visit went, because he had seen Dollars' buggy from the south pasture and come in early on purpose. She told him. He listened to the whole account and then he said, I want to tell you something. She said, all right. He said Margaret knew Dollars for 20 years, and she used to say that Dollars was like a fence with barbed wire on top. From a distance you thought the barbed wire was the whole fence, but up close you could see that what was holding the wire up was something solid and well built, and that the barbed wire was just what she used to make sure no one got close enough to damage the solid part. Henrietta said, that's a generous way to read it. Clayton said, Margaret was a generous reader. The space between them in those conversations was changing. She felt it, and she was fairly certain he felt it too, though he was considerably more disciplined than she was about showing nothing. He was a man who had loved someone deeply and lost them, and the wound of that was not closed, and she respected the wound and did not push toward it. But feelings, genuine ones, do not wait for permission. They arrive on their own schedule and in their own way, and they are not disciplined or tidy or careful about timing. It was the first week of November when it came to a head. The temperature had dropped sharply, confirming Eli's almanac prediction, and there was frost on the ground in the mornings, and ice on the water trough that had to be broken up before the horses could drink. Clayton and DeVoe had been working the fence lines for 3 days, and he was coming in tired and cold in the evenings, and she had started keeping soup on the back of the stove, so there was always something warm when he came in. On the Wednesday of that week he came in after dark, which was unusual. She had been holding the soup warm for 2 hours. The boys had eaten and been put to bed by 8 o'clock, Thomas with protesting, Samuel without, Eli with the particular gravity of a 10-year-old who has decided he is responsible for tracking when adults arrive home. Clayton came through the back door and stopped. He was cold through, she could see it in the way he held himself, and there was a cut on the back of his left hand, not deep but recent. She did not ask. She heated the soup and set it on the table and handed him a clean cloth for the hand without comment. He sat down. He ate. She sat across from him with her coffee because she had learned that he ate better when someone else was at the table and not in a way that was watching him, just present. When he finished he said, DeVoe quit today. She said, I'm sorry. Why, he said he's got family in Oklahoma and they need him. His father is ill. She said that's right for him to go. Clayton said, yes. But it leaves me short a hand at the worst time of year, and Carver is reliable but he can't do 2 men's work. She said, can you find someone in town? He said, I've put the word out, we'll see. She said, I can help with the outdoor work. He looked at her. She said, I'm not proposing to replace a ranch hand. But if there are things I can do that would free you and Carver for the heavier work, I can do them. I grew up around a farm in the early years. I know how things work. He said, that's not necessary. She said, I know it's not necessary, I'm offering. He looked at her for a moment with the particular look he had, the one that was evaluating something he had not decided about yet, and then he said, thank you, we'll figure it out. But he was still sitting there and he was not getting up to go to bed, and after a moment he said, can I ask you something? She said, yes. He said, the morning with the gravy, did you do that on purpose? The question landed with surprising precision. She considered lying. She considered hedging. She said, yes. He said, why? She said, because they hadn't laughed at breakfast in months. And I thought about what my mother used to do when things were very sad in our house, and I thought it might work. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother used to do something like that too, when things were hard. She used to start singing completely wrong words to hymns we all knew, and it was so unexpected and so ridiculous that we couldn't help ourselves." She said, "What would she sing instead?" He said, "Something completely absurd. She'd sing about a rooster getting into the general store at the Sunday hymns and everyone trying to chase it out." He shook his head, and there was something on his face that was both grief and affection at the same time. He said, "She was a wonderful woman. She said you loved her very much." He said, "I did. We lost her 8 years ago." She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "You say that a lot, I'm sorry. You mean it every time." She said, "I usually only say things I mean." He said, "I've noticed." And then he said, "Henrietta." It was the first time he had said her name. He had said Miss Ramsey consistently for 2 months with the careful formality of the arrangement they had. He said her name now, and it was quiet in the room, and the lamp was low and warm, and outside the wind was moving across the hill country carrying the cold with it. She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know how to do this. I want you to know that. I don't have a very good map for where I am right now." She said, "Neither do I," he said, "but I think I would like to try. If that is something you would want to try, not to rush anything or force anything, just to see if there is something here that is worth being honest about." She said, "I think there might be." He said, "Then I'd like to take you to supper in town on Saturday, if you'd be willing." She said, "I would." He said, "All right, good." And then, because he was Clayton Yates and he was still learning that muscle, he smiled. And it was less rusty this time. And she felt it somewhere in the middle of her chest, like a hand pressing gently against the inside of a locked door. The Saturday supper in town was the first time she had been with him in a context that was not the ranch, not the kitchen, not the practical day-to-day management of a household and its people. It was at the small restaurant on Main Street, which was run by a woman named Julia Marsh, who cooked the best beef stew in the county, and had the good sense not to make a fuss when Clayton Yates walked in with Henrietta Ramsey. Some of the other diners looked. Some of them looked harder than others. Henrietta kept her spine straight and her eyes steady, and Clayton kept his hand on the back of her chair, and his expression mild and untroubled by anyone's interest, which she recognized as a deliberate statement about what he considered worthy of being troubled by. They talked, genuinely talked, for the first time without the overlay of practicality. She learned that he had come to the hill country from East Texas when he was 22, with Margaret, who was 20, and 2 horses, and almost no money and a great deal of conviction that they could build something. She learned that he had read law for a year before deciding that the land was more compelling to him than the courtroom. She learned that he had a dry, precise wit that emerged in unexpected places, and that he liked to be surprised by things, which she found interesting in a man who was so apparently controlled. She told him about her father, James Ramsey, the man she had barely known before typhoid took him. She told him about growing up with her mother's stories about home, the way a leaner would describe a landscape with such vividness and affection that it was like looking at a painting. She told him about her love of reading, which had been her primary refuge in the difficult years, and about the books she had carried with her in the carpet bag and not listed on the inventory of her practical skills because reading did not seem like a practical skill for a domestic arrangement. He said, "What books?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have a second shelf in the study you haven't seen yet. You should come look at it." She said, "I should have known." He said, "What should you have known?" She said, "That you were a reader. It's visible in the way you listen." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You hear the whole sentence before you respond. Most people respond before the sentence is finished. Readers finish the sentence because they know there's no understanding a thing until you've taken all of it in." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You're right. I never thought about it that way." She said, "My mother said that." He said, "Your mother was right." On the drive home that night, with the stars enormous overhead in the cold November sky, and the horses moving at an easy pace along the dark road back to the ranch, Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was entirely different from the silence of that first drive. 7 miles of road that they had traversed twice now, and that had been completely transformed between the first crossing and this one. He reached over without looking at her and covered her hand with his briefly, a moment of uncalculated contact, and then removed it and kept driving, and she looked at the road ahead of them and felt something she had been very carefully keeping at a distance move through the last of the careful distance and arrive. November moved forward, and the household settled into a new pattern, one that had warmth in it now, warmth that was not desperate or performed but simply real. Dolores Fitch had made no further moves, which Henrietta suspected had something to do with a conversation Clayton had conducted with Owen Fitch at the feed store, a conversation she was not privy to, but whose effect was visible in the quiet that descended over the subject of Henrietta Ramsey's background. The boys felt the change in the air the way children always do, without necessarily naming what they feel. Thomas became more relaxed. The fighting at school stopped. His teacher sent a note home saying he had turned into a model student with suspicious suddenness, which made Clayton laugh. Samuel's stammer eased. He still caught on certain words, and she still waited for him, always waited, and he came to know that she would wait, and the knowing of it seemed to be enough. Eli began a correspondence with a boy in the next county who was also interested in astronomy, which Eli had apparently been reading about in a scientific journal he'd sent away for, and he brought the letters to Henrietta first, before showing them to his father, which was, she understood, a significant thing. The thing with the dog also resolved itself. Clayton came home one afternoon in mid-November with a 6-month-old dog of indeterminate breed, mostly brown with one white ear, that he put down in the yard and said nothing about. Samuel's face when he saw the dog was a thing Henrietta wished she could have painted and kept. He named the dog Biscuit, which Thomas said was an undignified name for a ranch dog, and Eli said, in the tone of someone who has already done the research, that dogs don't care what they're named, they care how they're treated, and so Biscuit it was. Clayton, watching Samuel race across the yard with the dog in pursuit, caught Henrietta's eye across the porch, and she saw in his face the particular quality of a man who has done something right and knows it, but is not going to make a statement about it. And she felt such a surge of affection for him that it was almost dizzying. He was courting her, in the deliberate, unhurried way of a man who does things properly and with full intention. He brought her a book from the shelves in the study, something he had read that he thought she would find interesting. He asked her opinion about practical decisions on the ranch and listened to the answers with genuine consideration and sometimes acted on them. He made sure she had the materials she needed for whatever project she had in hand. He never touched her without a kind of clear, respectful intention, a hand offered, not taken, a gesture that was invitation rather than assumption. She was falling in love with him, and she was not running from it anymore. The moment the falling became undeniable was a Sunday in early December, cold and still, with ice on the edges of the creek that ran through the south part of the ranch property. They had walked out there together in the early afternoon, which had become a habit when the weather allowed and the boys were occupied, and they were standing at the bank where the ice made a thin, clear shelf over the still water at the edge, and she was watching the water under the ice, and he was watching her. She felt him watching and turned, and there was nothing guarded in his face. Everything that had been behind the wall was out in front of it now, visible and unashamed, and what was there was something so clear and so complete that she felt her breath catch. He said, "I think I am in love with you." The words landed simply, without decoration or performance. Just a fact he was reporting. She said, "I think I am in love with you too." He said, "I want you to know that it doesn't feel like a replacement or an erasure. It feels like something else, something its own." She said, "I know." He said, "I don't know exactly how to do what comes next. I want to do it right." She said, "I don't need it done perfectly. I just need it to be real." He said, "It's real." He kissed her then, gently, unhurried, the way he did everything, and the cold air was around them and the ice was thin at the edge of the creek, and the winter sky was enormous and silver overhead, and it was exactly the right place for this particular beginning. Friedrich Baumann heard about it before anyone in town did, because Friedrich had been watching this situation with the close attention of a man who considers himself personally responsible for having suggested the arrangement in the first place. He showed up at the ranch on a Thursday morning in December with his wife, a small, cheerful German woman named Greta who had strong opinions about everything and expressed them without apology. And Greta went directly to Henrietta and took both her hands and said, in her particular mixture of German and English, that she was very glad indeed, and that Clayton had been too much alone for too long, and that those boys needed someone, and she could see already that this someone was the right someone. And did Henrietta know how to make Stahlen, because she was going to need to teach her? Henrietta said she did not know how to make Stahlen. Greta said, "Good, I will teach you. Come on Saturday." Friedrich shook Clayton's hand with great warmth and said something to him quietly that Henrietta did not hear, but which made Clayton's face do something private and grateful. Christmas came to the Yates ranch with a warmth it had not had in over a year. Henrietta made pie, 3 kinds, and Stahlen, with Greta's assistance, and a quantity of flour that was truly impressive. She and the boys decorated a cedar tree that Eli and Clayton cut and brought in from the back of the property, and Thomas took the responsibility of placing the star at the top, with the ceremony he brought to all important operations. Samuel explained to Biscuit what Christmas was at length, seated on the floor with the dog in his lap, and Biscuit appeared to find this information satisfactory. On Christmas morning, Clayton gave her a small wooden box that she had admired once in the window of the general store in town, saying it would be perfect for keeping her sewing needles and threads. That she had admired it once, only once, in passing, and he had remembered it and gone back and bought it without telling her, was the kind of attention that made her feel known in a way that was still new and still a little overwhelming. She gave him a book, a collection of essays she had found through the mail-order catalog, on the subject of land management and soil science, which she had chosen after the conversation he'd had with Eli about crop rotation, which she had overheard and which had made her understand what he would find interesting. He held it in both hands for a moment and looked at her and said, "You heard that conversation with Eli?" She said, "I was passing the doorway." He said, "And you remembered?" She said, "Of course I remembered." He said, "Henrietta," and he said it the way he had said it before, with that particular quality, and she felt it all the way through. In January, Clayton asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen, which was where so much of the real life of this house happened, and where she felt most herself, and she believed he knew that. He stood across the table from her with his hat in his hands, which was not something he usually did, and he said that he had been thinking about how to do this properly for some time, and that he wanted to offer her a real marriage, a true partnership, not just an arrangement, and that he would do everything in his power to be worthy of the trust she had placed in him, and that if she would agree to marry him, he would consider himself the luckiest man in the hill country and considerably beyond. She said yes before he had quite finished the sentence. He said, "You didn't let me finish." She said, "I didn't need to hear the rest." He said, "There was more to it." She said, "Tell me the rest." He said, "I love you." That was the rest. She said, "I love you too. Now come here." He came around the table and he was smiling, the full smile now, not rusty at all, and she put both hands on either side of his face and kissed him, and it was the kind of kiss that seals something, that closes one chapter and opens the next, and the boys walked in at the exact most inconvenient possible moment, all 3 of them, having apparently coordinated their entrance by some child's instinct. Thomas said loudly, "Are you 2 going to get married or what?" Samuel said, "I knew it. I told you, Eli, I told you." Eli said with great dignity, "I am unsurprised." Clayton looked at her over the tops of his sons' heads with an expression of helpless, delighted love that she was going to keep inside her for the rest of her life. She knew it the moment she saw it. The wedding was on the 14th of February, 1883, which had been Friedrich's suggestion, and which Greta had enthusiastically seconded, and which Clayton had proposed to Henrietta with the slight self-consciousness of a man who knows it is an obvious choice, and is not sure if obvious is the right register. She told him she thought it was exactly right. The ceremony was at the small white church with the crooked steeple, performed by the Reverend Cal Whitmore, who had a fine speaking voice and the good sense to keep the ceremony warm and the words true without going on too long. Greta Baumann cried. Friedrich did not cry, but his eyes were very bright. The boys were in their best clothes, Thomas holding himself with great importance, Samuel vibrating with barely contained energy, Eli standing absolutely still with the particular dignity he brought to solemn occasions. Dolores Fitch was in the congregation. She had come, which Henrietta had not entirely expected. She sat in the fourth pew on the right, and when the ceremony was over she approached Henrietta and said, with a formality that was its own kind of softening, that she hoped Henrietta would be very happy and that she could see, she said it carefully, she could see that those children were better for having her. It was as close to an apology as Dolores Fitch was constitutionally capable of delivering, and Henrietta accepted it for what it was. The town of Colder Creek turned out to be, for the most part, as Clayton had said, not all of them as narrow as Dolores. There were some who kept their distance, and some who were warm from the beginning, and most who fell somewhere in the middle, which is where most people fall, because the middle is where ordinary life is lived. She was practical and capable, and the boys were visibly healthier and happier, and the Yates ranch was clearly well managed, and in a ranching community, these are the things that ultimately speak. The spring of 1883 was excellent for the ranch. Clayton found a reliable new hand, a man named Beto Espinoza, who had been working cattle since he was 15, and who had a particular gift with horses that Eli admired with deep seriousness. The south pasture fence was rebuilt properly and held through the wet spring without trouble. The garden that Henrietta had reclaimed from its neglect the previous autumn came up beautifully, the beds she had prepared through the winter rewarding her with more productivity than she had expected from soil that had been left to compact for over a year. Thomas turned 11 in April and marked the occasion by informing his father that he intended to become a veterinary surgeon, which was apparently what his interest in animals had been building toward without anyone paying close attention. Clayton and Henrietta sat with this announcement at the dinner table and treated it with the seriousness it deserved, and Henrietta wrote to a medical school in San Antonio asking about the existence of veterinary programs, and when the reply came back, she read it to Thomas at the kitchen table while he leaned forward with both elbows on the wood and his face absolutely focused. Samuel, who had turned 8 in March, had discovered that he had a remarkable talent for drawing. He filled the margins of his school papers with small, precise pictures of animals and plants and the things he observed, and Mrs. Popworth, the schoolteacher, brought this to Henrietta's attention when she came to collect the boys one afternoon in town, saying that she had seen artistic talent before in her years of teaching, but rarely this particular quality of observation in so young a child. Henrietta told Samuel this that evening. She told him exactly what Mrs. Popworth had said, and she watched Samuel's face do the thing faces do when something true and good is said about them, the small involuntary brightness that can't be manufactured. Eli, who had turned 11 in February with great solemnity, continued to be Eli, which was its own remarkable thing. He had taken to Henrietta with the full commitment of a child who had spent considerable time evaluating the situation and concluded it was sound, and his version of affection was a kind of steady, reliable presence that she found deeply moving. He was the one who noticed when she was tired before anyone else did. He was the one who brought her the almanac to share his weather predictions for the week. He was the one who said, on the occasion of her first anniversary with their father, entirely of his own volition, that he was glad she had come, and then went back to his book as if the statement had been a simple observation requiring no further comment. She cried a little after he left the room. Clayton found her at the kitchen window and said, "What happened?" And she told him, and he said, "That's Eli's version of a declaration." She said, "I know. It was perfect." He put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they stood at the window looking out at the spring evening, and the garden and the paddock and the hill country stretching out beyond the fence line, and she thought about Alina, and about the landscape Alina described with such love, and she thought that this, here, was a landscape she could love like that. In June of 1883, she told Clayton she was expecting a child. She told him on the front porch in the evening, with the last light of the day still warm on the cedar planks and the sound of the boys and biscuits somewhere around the back of the house, and he was very still for a moment when she told him, and then he pulled her close with a gentleness that contained a whole world of feeling in it. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm perfectly all right. I'm happy." He said, "I am too, more than I know how to say." She said, "You'll find a way to say it." He said, "Give me a minute." She laughed. The boys were told that evening after supper in the kitchen. Thomas responded with the executive interest of someone calculating how this would affect household operations. Samuel said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" And when told no one knew yet, he said he wanted a brother, and then immediately said, "Or a sister would be good too. I don't mind." Eli looked at Henrietta for a long moment, and then said that he thought that was very good news, and the warmth in his voice when he said it was the most Eli had ever sounded like any of the others. The pregnancy was steady and uncomplicated, which Henrietta attributed partly to constitution and partly to the fact that she was living in a house full of people who went out of their way to ensure she was not doing anything too taxing without always being obvious about it. Clayton was attentive without being smothering, which was the exact right balance, and she told him so. He said he was trying. She said he was succeeding. Friedrich and Greta became an increasingly important part of their life through the summer, coming to Sunday dinners regularly with a warmth and ease that made those meals feel like a fuller, richer thing. Greta had taken Henrietta under her wing in the particular way of a woman who loves well and broadly, and has decided that her love includes this new person now, and that is simply the way of it. Friedrich and Clayton were the kind of friends who could work side by side all day, and not feel the need to fill the silence, and then talk easily over supper, which Henrietta thought was a rarer thing between men than it should be. The summer passed in that full, measured way that good summers pass when you are aware enough to let them. Henrietta grew the garden into something Margaret would have loved, and knew it was not a replacement for Margaret's garden but a continuation of it, grown from the same soil with different hands and the same love for the living thing. Thomas argued with his father about the proper care of a horse with a sprained tendon, citing the veterinary text that Henrietta had ordered for him from a catalog in San Antonio, and the argument was conducted with such passionate competence on Thomas's part, and such loving tolerance on Clayton's, that it became a story told at supper for weeks. Samuel produced a drawing of Biscuit that was so accurate and alive that Henrietta had it framed and put it on the wall of the parlor, which Samuel pretended not to find deeply satisfying, and which everyone could see he found deeply satisfying. Eli began a project of mapping the ranch property, the water sources and fence lines and pasture areas, with a precision that made Clayton stop and look at the emerging maps with genuine respect. Clayton said, "Where did you learn to do this?" And Eli said, "I read about cartography," and then showed his father 3 books on the subject that he had obtained from a correspondence with a library in Austin. And Clayton said, "Well, we'll need to get you better instruments then," and sent away for a proper compass and measuring equipment that arrived in September, and made Eli go very quiet in the way he went quiet when something had moved him too much to be casual about. The baby came in February of 1884, on a cold, clear night with stars so bright they seemed close enough to affect the proceedings, and he was a healthy, loud boy whom they named James, for her father, and Robert, for Clayton's grandfather, and who arrived in the world with an apparent conviction that he deserved to be announced loudly and thoroughly, which conviction he did not abandon in the days and weeks that followed. Samuel said, "He is very loud," in a tone of scientific interest. Thomas said, "He's small but he has good lungs." Eli held him with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been told, "He can do something," and is determined to do it exactly right, and looked down at the small face with an expression of such unguarded wonder that Henrietta pressed her hand to her mouth. Clayton sat beside her that night after the boys were in bed, and James was sleeping in the cradle that had been retrieved from the storage shed and cleaned and repaired by Clayton's own hands over the preceding weeks, and he held her hand and did not need to say anything in particular because everything was said in the holding. He said, eventually, "This is what I hoped for when I thought about what the future might look like." "Before I thought I could hope for it," she said, "and what does it look like?" He said, "Like this, exactly like this." She said, "I never thought I would have this. When I left Beaumont, I thought I was just running." He said, "You were running, and you ran exactly where you were supposed to go." She said, "I like that version." He said, "It's the true version." The years that followed built on each other with the satisfying accumulation of a life that is being lived well by people who have decided to live it together fully. The ranch grew and became more productive. Beto became an essential part of the operation, and Clayton treated him with the respect of partnership rather than the condescension of employment. And this was noticed and appreciated by everyone who worked on or around the property. Eli, at 14, was managing the property maps with such precision that Clayton began using them for actual planning decisions. And Friedrich said at one of their Sunday dinners that in another 10 years, Eli Yates was going to be running the whole county, which made Eli go slightly pink under his composure. Thomas's conviction about veterinary medicine did not waver with time, which sometimes happened with childhood ambitions, but did not happen with Thomas's because Thomas was constitutionally incapable of changing his mind once he had thoroughly investigated a subject and concluded. At 15, he was riding out with the ranch's usual large animal doctor, an older man named Dr. Fitch, no relation to Dollars, who operated out of the county seat and who recognized in Thomas a seriousness of interest that made him worth teaching. Samuel at 12 was drawing everything. He drew the landscape and the animals and the people in his life with a quality that kept improving past what anyone would have predicted, and a traveling art instructor who came through Colder Creek in the autumn of 1885 saw his work and said things about it that Henrietta repeated to Clayton that evening with her eyes bright, and Clayton listened and then said, "He gets to go where his gift goes. However far that is. We'll make sure of it." She said, "We will." James, who was 2 and then 3 and then 4, was the particular joy of a youngest child who has 3 older brothers who collectively feel responsible for his education in all things, and who disagree constantly and vocally about the proper approach. He navigated this with a good-natured equanimity that was so striking in a small child that Henrietta sometimes watched him and thought she could see already the kind of man he was going to be, steady and warm and quietly sure of himself. Dollars Fitch died in the spring of 1886, after a short illness that was a surprise to everyone, because Dollars had seemed too formidable a personality to be brought down by anything so ordinary as a fever. What happened in the weeks after her death surprised Henrietta even more. Owen Fitch came to the ranch and said that Dollars, in the last days of her illness, had asked him to tell Henrietta that she regretted the beginning and respected the whole of it, and that she had been wrong to set a trap for a woman who deserved the benefit of the doubt. Owen Fitch said this very carefully, as if he had memorized the words. He said Dollars had made him promise to say it exactly right. Henrietta stood on the front porch and thought about Margaret Yates, whom she had never met, and about the woman who had loved Margaret and had transferred that love, imperfectly and defensively at first, into a protection of what Margaret had left behind. She thought about how grief makes people into versions of themselves that are not always the best version, and how the best you could do was try to move through it toward something better. She said, "Thank you for telling me. Please tell Mr. Fitch that I am grateful, and that I think Mrs. Fitch was, at the bottom of it, exactly what my husband once described her as. Well-built, holding up the wire." Owen Fitch looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled, a small, private smile that told her Clayton had been exactly right about the dollars that was under the surface. In 1887, Henrietta found out she was expecting again. James was 3 and confident of his position in the household and magnanimous about the prospect of sharing it, saying at the dinner table that he would teach the new baby everything he knew, which Thomas pointed out was a shorter lesson than James seemed to believe, and the table erupted, and Clayton caught her eye across the noise and the warmth of his 4 sons laughing at the same table, and she thought, this is what the burned gravy morning was the beginning of. This full, loud, laughing table. This life. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1887, with dark hair and her father's eyes, and a voice that Samuel said with admiration was going to be impressive when she got older. They named her Elena, for her grandmother, who had survived everything survival required in order to bring Henrietta into the world, who had burned the cornbread on purpose on a hard day, and given her daughter a way of understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is make something go wrong on purpose, so there is room for something real to come through. Clayton Yates learned to say the word biscuit before she learned most other words, which everyone correctly attributed to the dog being the most visible thing in her field of vision for the entirety of her first year. Biscuit, who had grown from an indeterminate 6-month-old puppy into a solid, devoted, slightly graying ranch dog, regarded Elena with the kind of patient, resigned affection that spoke of someone who had accepted a new responsibility without being consulted about it. On the morning of Elena's first birthday, Henrietta stood at the iron stove in the kitchen of the Yates ranch house, with the October light coming through the window, and the sound of her children in the next room, James singing something tuneless and enthusiastic to his sister, Eli and Thomas having a low, focused conversation about something agricultural, Samuel probably drawing, and she made the gravy for the biscuits. She could feel Clayton's presence behind her before she heard him. She had been able to feel it for 5 years, and it still had the quality of something that arrived rather than something expected. He came to stand beside her at the stove and looked into the skillet and said, "The gravy is fine." She said, "I know." He said, "You're not going to burn it this time." She said, "I don't need to, they already know how to laugh." He was quiet for a moment and she felt his hand settle at the small of her back, warm and steady in the October morning. He said, "You know what I think about." She said, "The morning with the gravy." He said, "Every time I walk into this kitchen." She said, "What do you think about it?" He said, "I think about standing in that doorway and watching my sons laugh at breakfast for the first time in so long. I had almost forgotten what it sounded like. And I think about looking at you and knowing something had changed and not being able to name it yet." She said, "Could you name it now?" He said, "Yes." She said, "What is it?" He said, "Everything. It changed everything." From the next room, James said with the authority of a 4-year-old who had learned exactly how to deploy volume for maximum effect, "Breakfast is ready." She said, "It's not ready yet, James." He said, "It smells ready." Thomas said, "The gravy is burning." She said, "It is not burning." Samuel said, "It smells a little like burning." Eli said, "It smells exactly like the morning you burned it on purpose." I remember that morning. And then James said, "Wait, what? You burned it on purpose?" And the whole house came undone in the best possible way. Laughter from every room, 5 children's worth of it, running up the walls and out into the October morning. And Biscuit barked once from the yard as if in solidarity. And the gravy was fine. It was completely fine. And Clayton Yates stood in his kitchen on an October morning in 1888 with his wife beside him and his children around him and his life full and real and earned. And he laughed too. And Henrietta Ramsey, who had run toward something without knowing exactly what she was running toward, who had burned the gravy on purpose on a cold morning 6 years ago and watched it change the world inside this house, stirred the gravy and turned and looked at all of them. All this life she had built in the ruins of the old one. And she thought about her mother and about cornbread, and about the way love shows up in the shape of small, deliberate, ridiculous gestures that say, "I see you in your grief. And I am going to make you laugh anyway." She thought, this is what my mother gave me, the knowledge that you can make something go wrong on purpose to let the right thing in. She said, "Sit down, all of you. Breakfast is ready." They sat. The table was full and loud and warm. Biscuit came through the back door uninvited, as he always did, and settled under Samuel's chair, as he always did. James explained to Alina, with the elaborate patience of a 4-year-old educating a 1-year-old, what biscuits were and why they were important. Eli read something quietly from the almanac to Thomas, who listened with one eyebrow raised. Samuel ate with one hand and sketched with the other, which he always did, which Henrietta had stopped mentioning because the drawings were worth it. Clayton poured her coffee first, as he always did. She looked at him across the table. He looked back. And in the October morning, in the hill country of Texas, in the house that had been rebuilt from grief into something new and full and entirely its own, they had breakfast together, and everyone laughed, and the gravy was perfect. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.